Hey, everybody, we are back for another episode of the Ship Show series. Today is Thursday, June 21st, 2023, or Thursday, June 22nd, 2023. And this is episode number 23 in our yearly series. So I'm flying solo today with Jason traveling on business. And as a result of that, I thought I would take a deeper dive and talk about a very interesting subject that is front and center in supply chain today as companies start to decouple from China and think about decoupling from China as a result of China's zero COVID policy, trade wars, and the geopolitical tinderbox of Taiwan, and the deteriorating relationship with the USA. So, the title for today's show is Are you thinking about moving your manufacturing in China? And what are some of the initial decisions? So, let's first start with, one of the most biggest questions that everyone's been thinking about is has sourcing from China become too risky? And the uncertainty surrounding products manufacturing in China is causing many foreign companies apologies, is causing many foreign companies to ask what can they do to mitigate their risk and where else could they look for getting their products made. I think decisions about leaving China are not without risk, but there is a path forward. Now, usually we start reminding people that leaving China is already happening. You won't be the first to think about this or the first one to do it. And companies are leaving, are already leaving, including Chinese companies looking for other places to make their stuff. And needless to say, other countries are vigorously competing for this business. So your path forward may not be a super highway, but there are some fairly well paved roads to get you there. And partnering with supply chain solutions or thinking about partnering with supply chain solutions is the first great decision you could make because we have a well connected network of partners and agents and trading companies around the globe that have relationships in a local environment that can help you source the products you need. And we're already having a lot of success doing this for some of our top clients who are starting to look at moving away from China. Now, many companies are focusing on the ASEAN countries, which is the Association of Southeastern Asian Nations, as an alternative, as a China alternative. Specifically, countries like Thailand and Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, and the Philippines. And companies are looking to these Asian countries because many of the clients are already familiar with the region. It's close to China and Chinese existing supplier base. It has competitive manufacturing costs, and it has a large and diverse manufacturing capacity. And there are really a lot of benefits from the various governments supporting and supportive manufacturing export. So uh, it doesn't hurt that these ASEAN countries consist of approximately 650 million people or consumers. And again, the ASEAN, the Association of Southeastern Asian Nations, has a free trade agreement with China. And this also means that a company can find new manufacturing sources in an ASEAN country and still usually obtain needed materials and components from China tariff free at similar costs. So this means you can start to leave China without completely leaving China. But I think one of the most important questions is first, are you thinking about moving from China? And when companies think about moving manufacturing from China, it's really important to first determine why the company wants to leave China and what they are trying to accomplish by doing so. And increasing cost and tariffs may be driving companies out of China, but other factors really need to be considered before deciding whether you really want to leave and where you're going to leave to. And I think it's important to note that every country does different things well. Every company looking to leave China needs to decide what is most important for them, their products, their markets, their IP protection, AKA their intellectual property protections, their supply chains, and what's the future direction of their business unit. So these are things that you really need to think about if you're considering moving away from China. And I think first and foremost, finding a new supplier or location to operate a factory is really a significant business decision, and it should be treated as such. Some of our clients are interested in finding new suppliers, and some want to start up entire new factories themselves. So we need to clearly distinguish between the two. And I think, in sourcing, for example, the range of what can and will be done is huge. From a simple purchase of an exchangeable commodity product, all the way to purchasing, high tech electronics, where the factory is expected to provide some substantial engineering input. So some of our clients are highly focused on cost, while others are highly focused on quality. And one of the main things I always tell some of our clients, and we have a very large company out here in northern New Jersey, where we're based at on the East Coast, and they import a lot of confections and chocolates. So they asked us if we can help them resource some of their packaging materials, and we were quite successful in doing that. But there's so many different things you need to think about, and this client was really focused on these packaging materials having certain quality standards and meeting their specifications. So that was, equally as important as the cost associated with the manufacturing. So it's those kind of things that you want to look at. But there are clients that make products for which, for example, Thailand was perfect. There are other clients that make the same product, but essentially for an entirely different market, for which Mexico is perfect. Okay. So in choosing a country and a specific supplier, there is rarely a one size fits all answer. And yes, quite often companies end up determining that it's best to stay in China and hedge the risk associated with staying. Now, tariffs or no tariffs, costs are rising in China. They have an aging population. Many of the younger people, those Gen Zs and those millennials growing up in China now don't want to work in the factories. And it's becoming a more difficult place to do business, especially for American companies. And most indications are that it's only going to get worse. And in the last year or so, it's been brutal for firms whose bottom lines hinge on continuous, reliable, uninterrupted change. And that's as much from the uncertainty and the chance of even more trade barriers, as well as the actual duties imposed in addition to the geopolitical tinderbox of China, which is just hanging out there, in the background like a specter, and everyone's waiting for the other shoe to drop. But I think in the end, the decision to move your manufacturing is, of course, up to your company, but it has to make sense for your organization, not only from a cost perspective, but from a quality perspective for your products as well. And I think it's really important to note that I think everyone knows that China has been the factory of the world for the past 4 decades. And the pandemic triggered a reckoning of this status. That facade started to crumble around 2018 after President Donald Trump launched a trade war against the East Asian giant, China, as a result of China's years of unfair trade practices and stealing of intellectual property. So this in turn has really prompted investors to reassess their geopolitical risk. And this is one of the biggest reasons what's driving this decoupling from China. While some investors did move parts of their manufacturing facilities out of China at that time, it was the pandemic and China's zero COVID policy that drove home the importance of not depending on one country for their manufacturing needs, especially when it's strategic. What's some people in government, no matter what country you're from, strategic national security needs, pharmaceutical, energy, things like that. They didn't want to continue to rely on China as that one central location. Now, the geopolitical tensions in themselves may have not resulted into this level of realignment of supply chains, but COVID certainly provided an extra vision and extra motivation uh, to add that extra fuel to the fire and the effects of that trade war, which is still even lingering now. And then we should also think about or note that, President Biden, hasn't entirely put the kibosh on the elevated tariffs that President Trump imposed on China. In fact, in October, he imposed export controls on shipping equipment to Chinese owned factories making advanced logic chips or semiconductor chips. And this really further burdened and strained the relationship between the USA and China. So, you know, to navigate this complicated web of the USA trying to change Shenzhen's, multinationals are now more than ever looking to hedge their business risks. So, as a result of these questions, as a result of thinking about has sourcing from China become too risky? Are you thinking about moving from China? And then again, thinking about the overall big picture of how China has been the world's, factory for the past 4 decades, it kind of, spurred me to continue doing a deeper dive and do deeper research. And we found some key findings. And I think there's an overall index of emerging countries right now that are going to step into that role that China is starting to move itself out of for a number of reasons. So, at the top of the list of the top 10 emerging countries, China is still number one, but it's in decline. Okay. And then heading up the list after China at number two is India. Believe it or not, United Arab Emirates, UAE, is a big emerging economy where a lot of great manufacturing is being done right now. And then following up UAE is Malaysia, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Thailand, Mexico, and Vietnam. And I looked at many things. There was a great emerging market index ranking that I thought was just phenomenal. And I wish I could share that with you as well today. But then I wanted to think about, if you are going to move sourcing in 2023 and beyond, you know, do you plan to move production sourcing activities to any of the following regions? So I'd like to give you a review of some of these regions right now, if I may. So, when we think of China, they're still number one. And while China has retained its position at the top of the index, the past year has really been characterized by potential economic and social upheaval. And there's really a new worrying or state of affairs for a government which prides itself on continuity and advancement. And at the root of the problem in China is the effect of the COVID-19 pandemic and their zero tolerance policy that it adopted to prevent the spread of the disease throughout its population. And even though it seems like CD19 is well behind us, there's still a lot of things going on in China that really doesn't come out to the Western media that's going on behind the scenes. And this has really had some severe consequences for their economy, which really is only forecasted to grow weekly this year compared to the standards of 2022. And really, I think a lot of the growth in China this year was influenced by whether the government loosened its regulations. And it has done some loosening of their belt there of some of their regulations, but there's still a lot of pent up demand that could be released, driving forward once again the Chinese to be number one in the global economy. But there's also a risk as well. And I think the return to normality is really, uh, you know, going to be precipitated on the spread of CV-19, keeping that under control, and not overwhelming their healthcare systems and throwing the government's policy response into confusion. So, as we all know, the kind of news that comes out of China, sometimes it's hit or miss, but you have to think of things like the geopolitical tensions right now going on over there. There's a lot of domestic concerns, and that's only one part of the country's problems. Specifically regarding Taiwan, you know, we saw last year when Speaker Pelosi visited Taiwan in August, it prompted China's military to undertake live firing exercises in the waters around the island. And that totally disrupted air and shipping lanes. So that was really, to me, a clear signal and a clear signal to the international community that the blockade of Taiwan could be used as a diplomatic and economic lever, should, God forbid, we ever get to that point. And given the reliance on the global semiconductor industry of Taiwanese manufacturers, especially in terms of the most advanced technologies, the West really has taken steps to try to establish its own factories in the United States, in Arizona, other places around the world, while simultaneously preventing China from gaining access to technology that could really be used for military purposes. And then as we tie up China, we have to continue thinking about, how they want to capture supply chain value. And, really, I think a further pillar of the Chinese government policy has been the capture of supply chain value by increasing the domestically sourced proportion of intermediate goods in China. In the everyone's heard of in the factory Asia model, intermediaries produced across the region have typically been transported to China for final assembly. So that means that Chinese manufacturers lose out on much of the value adding process. The final assembly being low cost and commoditized, it's a commoditized undertaking. It's dependent on cheap labor. And the government has recognized that for its industry to ascend the value chains, it had to invest in the know-how and the facilities, which would preclude the need to import components from competitor countries throughout the region. So this so-called in China for China policy production strategy has really been kicked into overdrive and developed by China. So they really, as I said, wanted to capture more of this supply chain value. And then lastly, we have to think about the supply chain decoupling. So whether zero tolerance COVID policy, the establishment of dual technology supply chains, made in China value, um, um, or the fallout from the treatment of the Uyghur community, China is really slowly becoming decoupled from the global supply chains. And this is going to be a very long process given the importance of the market to the rest of the world. But it is a trend which cannot be ignored. And this will create a massive tension between the world's largest military and the economic powers. But I really believe it's going to bring a lot of opportunities for smaller countries in the region, the so-called China Plus sourcing locations. Now, what I thought was really interesting is, you know, China is losing its place as the center of the world's supply chains, and China's COVID-19 policies are pushing companies to diversify supply chains away from the country. And these countries had already begun moving out over geopolitical tensions, anyhow, and tariffs from the Trump era. And now we have the Taiwan situation, which, as I said, is a geopolitical tinderbox. But here are the top 5 places supply chains are going instead. And that's going to be India, Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia, Bangladesh. And I'd like to say Mexico is really, really right in there. Really, there's a top 6. And I think what you're going to see is you're really going to see Mexico play a larger role as this process continues to accelerate and snowball. And these are really the 5 or 6 countries that are stepping up to replace the world's factory, which is China, for the past 4 decades. And, as we all know, and as I said, the pandemic triggered the reckoning of this. And so, let's take a look at India, for example. India has made significant progress in the last decade to modernize its logistics and supply chain industry. And by doing so, it's been able to really deliver some amazing, strong economic growth. And this has including a goods and service tax, as well as an electronic way bill for transportation providers, crossing state borders, which has reduced corruption and transit times. And at the same time, the government has also looked at ways of making logistics more efficient by addressing bottlenecks and introducing technology and streamlining major transport infrastructure projects, which has really plagued India a lot over the years. It really created a lot of delays and caused a lot of mismanagement because of some of these issues with their infrastructure. And last year in 2022, the government of India introduced a national logistics policy, which had been developed to build on the progress to date. And this included the creation of a unified digital platform that's going to provide end-to-end visibility for importers and exporters, as well as the creation of a multimodal network that's going to leverage an underutilized rail system, which we know the rail system's been very underutilized. So, India is really one of the main emerging countries where we're going to see a lot of production shift to, because India is trying to unseat China as a higher end manufacturing, with iPhone maker Apple and chip makers eyeing its vast land and young population as a prime area to move production. And I thought it was really interesting to note that iPad manufacturing is moving from Southern Asia right into India. And they expect to move about 5% of the iPhone manufacturing now to India by the end of 2023. And they said that, something I read, they believe that 1 in 4 iPhones are going to be made in India by 2025. So India is a real great place for people to think about moving to. And then next on the list is Vietnam. Vietnam's been undergoing rapid economic reform since 1986, which has yielded really some significant returns. Their reforms have yielded results propelling Vietnam from one of the world's poorest nations to a middle income economy in one generation. And, I read a statistic that in 2022, Vietnam attracted over 31.15 billion of FDI, of foreign direct investment pledges, up more than 9% from the prior year, according to the country's Ministry of Planning and Investment. So about 60% of the investments went into manufacturing and went into their manufacturing and process center. So when we think about Vietnam, some of their key strengths in the manufacturing of apparel and footwear and electronics and electrical appliances. And, as I said, Apple has already moved some of their production of the iPhone into Vietnam already. And they're also making some of the MacBooks. Okay. And then there's other companies that have shifted some of their production lines out of China to Vietnam, companies like Nike and Adidas and Samsung. So even though Vietnam is exceptionally well placed to benefit from China's difficulties, the government has much work to do for it to create a robust industrial environment, which will attract high quality manufacturers to create, value adding for its local suppliers. But, Vietnam is definitely on the rise along with India. And then we have to go right into Thailand. And Thailand's FDI, foreign direct investment, rose threefold between 2020 and 2022. And, Thailand has always been categorized as Southeast Asia's lost cost country, the LCC, the lost cost country. Thailand's economy has, over the past 2 decades, becoming has become increasingly integrated with global value chains as companies have increasingly unbundled and outsourced parts of their production to Thailand. And although this created many opportunities, the trend has meant that the economy has also become highly vulnerable to the rising cost and supply chain disruptions, such as, the result of CV-19 pandemic. So, and that really drove cost up, but it was particularly affected by the capacity challenges faced by the shipping industry on the Trans-Pacific trade lane, and that resulted in a lot of high rates. But Thailand is still an emerging country that's going to be key as we move forward, and really the country has become the beneficiary of China's plus risk mitigation sourcing strategies being increasingly employed by global manufacturers. And it's especially important in the electronic manufacturing services, the sector, into the EMS sector, where you think about medical equipment and agri-tech, agricultural technical sector. So they've really provided a ready alternative for companies wishing to migrate away from or complement the Chinese suppliers. It's given them a really good option. And while the southeastern countries such as Vietnam may have lower labor costs, Thailand is more technologically advanced, especially in green economy, including the manufacturing of electric vehicles. And they're going to see a lot of that happen in Thailand as we move forward into 2024 and beyond. So, as it's important to keep in mind that as Southeast Asia's second largest economy, Thailand has been moving up the value chain of manufacturing, and its production hub for car parts and vehicles and electronics, with multinationals such as Sony and Sharp setting up shop there. So, for Thailand, the sky is really the limit for them. And then I'd like to just quickly go through a few more countries. Bangladesh is another great area, and it's really a beneficiary of a supply chain shift away from China, and it now wants a bigger slice of the pie. So even before CV-19 lockdowns crippled China's manufacturing sector, Bangladesh was already a rising star in the garment and manufacturing sector. And in our New Jersey operation, we have a huge safety company that, imports a huge amount of their safety products from Bangladesh, and the quality of the products is tremendous. But, Bangladesh's rise was primarily due to rising labor costs in China, predating President Trump's presidency. So, as the labor costs started to go up in China and the workforce became more westernized, some of these other peripheral countries benefited from that. So we saw a shift over the Bangladesh. And I think what you'll find really interesting is the cost difference is large, with an average monthly salary of a coworker in Bangladesh at $120. So think about that. The average monthly salary for a worker in a Bangladesh factory is $120, and that's considered being well paid, or less than one fifth of the $670 that a factory worker takes home in one of the southern China manufacturing hubs, for example, in Guangzhou. So, even though it doesn't seem like a great deal of money to most of us here in the States, they're well paid in their countries, but that's a real big disparity in labor costs between Bangladesh and China. And moreover, the rising material cost is pushing apparel companies to look at alternative destinations like Bangladesh, where production prices are comparatively low. So, despite a high profile building collapse that killed over 1,100 people in April in 2013 and dented Bangladesh's work safety reputation, the garment manufacturing industry is a key pillar of their economy and has rebounded incredibly since that catastrophe back in 2013. And nearly 85% of its shipments, over $42 billion worth of the country's exports, are garment and manufacturing. So the country is the world's second largest garment exporter after China. So Bangladesh has been in overdrive trying to attract investment beyond the garment sector and the other sectors of their manufacturing, like pharmaceuticals and agriculture processing. And then I'd like to try to fast forward real quick to Malaysia, that's in that top 5 or 6 of the emerging countries that we spoke about earlier. So Malaysia has for years been eyeing opportunities emerging from companies shifting away from China. And the country has not been immune to the fallout of the global pandemic, as many manufacturers were impacted by the whiplash effect of supply and demand sourcing decisions by their overseas customers. And this resulted in a policy decision by the Malaysian government to place resilience at the heart of its next 5 year supply chain plan. Okay. And Malaysia is one of those countries that's been very aggressive in creating these 3 and 5 and 10 year plans. And, this really involves a focus on what it calls local source facilitation. And that is encouraging and facilitating major manufacturers in their country to use domestic suppliers, okay, rather than those located in other countries, okay? And the government in Malaysia believes that by local policy, it's going to reduce supply chain disruptions such as export bans and border closures. And indeed, the impact of China's zero COVID tolerance approach, which was devastating and damaging to many other economies within the Southeast Asian area. So, this will not only increase resilience for Malaysia, but the government believes that it's really also going to create a spillover benefit cascading down to the local businesses in their country. So I think it's important to note that it has made some headway with the efforts, as it attracted at least 32 projects that have relocated from China to Malaysia. And the Malaysian Investment Development Authority announced that just in July of last year. So I think when I was looking at this yesterday, it was 32 projects from last July, and now it's at 47 projects. And looking at some of my notes right here. But again, even before the pandemic, tech investments into Malaysia had been rising because of a lower labor cost and the trade tensions between the U.S. and China. So there's a lot of great things happening in Malaysia, and there's been a lot of major deals in the last few years, including 1.5 billion in Malaysian ringgit, which is their currency, or that translates to $339 million of investment by the U.S. chip giant Micron. So the United States is investing in the Malaysian manufacturing hub by starting its own chip manufacturing company in Malaysia. So I think Malaysia's FDI, foreign direct investment inflows, hit a 5 year high last year at 48.1 billion. And that's according to their official government information. And then just closing this up, because I know we're running a little long here today, let's just talk a little bit about Mexico. Okay, so Mexico, where Supply Chain Solution has just announced the opening of their new Mexico operation, as well as our new operation located in Dallas, Texas, which is going to be a tremendous corridor for shipments going into Mexico and out of Mexico, and going cross border from the border towns of Laredo and Nogales, okay, into Houston. And our Dallas operation is going to be incredible. But Mexico really must invest to benefit from this reshoring initiative that's going on right now. And it's important to note that Mexico is exceptionally well placed to take advantage of the USA's deteriorating relationship with China. But it must invest in its infrastructure and its networks and its people if it's going to exploit the opportunities. And that's always been a weakness for Mexico. And Mexico's existing economic integration with the U.S. economy and its stable political relationship as a result of the USMCA trade agreement, which President Trump put in place, gives it a huge advantage as the reshoring and nearshoring trends take hold. And the ongoing trade war, the export bans on advanced technologies, and ethical legislation, which prevents U.S. companies from sourcing goods from the Xinjiang region of China, and the fallout from China's COVID policy have really directly resulted in an increase in U.S. Mexico cross border volume. So, logistics, trucking, and rail companies are really ramping up their operations to leverage this upturn in business. And Mexico has significant advantages over many other markets considered, as alternatives to China. But it needs to build the necessary production ecosystem, which is really going to provide investors with that confidence to locate their manufacturing to that country, to relocate that manufacturing to Mexico. So there really also needs to be a change in the attitude on both sides of the border if Mexico is going to prosper from any of these moves towards a concept of ally shoring, okay, since Mexico is considered an ally to the U.S. And the mutual distrust and Mexico's existing links with China could compromise any future growth opportunities. But I think this is something, again, that we have to work on. And again, as I mentioned just a few moments ago, Supply Chain Solutions, has just announced the opening of our new operations down in Texas and Dallas and down in Mexico. So it's really going to be a tremendous opportunity for all of our clients and potential clients. And then lastly, I just want to finish it up with Indonesia and UAE and make some final comments. So then there's a couple of X factor countries like the United Arab Emirates. And, people probably would have never thought of UAE as an emerging country, but the investments made by the UAE over the last few decades in its transport and logistics infrastructure have really propelled the country to the top of the echelons of the emerging markets in logistics. And there's really no sign of any complacency, despite the signs of a global recession and deglobalization. Okay. And, they've heavily invested in the digital, this is a hard word to say, the digitalization, okay, the digitalization of its ports and airports and roads and rail networks. They've invested a lot into that infrastructure. So the government is really prioritizing its digital capabilities, and it really sees growth of e-commerce market as a major opportunity for UAE, facilitated by an already developed internet capabilities that it has, an advanced digital payment system. So the digitalization is regarded as being a key to address many of the inefficiencies that used to exist in UAE in the international logistics and supply chain sector. So I think a significant portion of their air and sea freight bookings are still undertaken by phone and fax. And, containers are often lost. 20% of the boxes of the full container boxes do not turn up to their book departure time, because terminals have been congested in the past and ships have departed later due to these type of problems with customs and paperwork because of the poor visibility. So as a result, the UAE government took a step back and, wanted to see what they needed to do to make this more efficient. And so now this embracing of this this digitalization has really put them into hyperdrive, and you're going to hear a lot more from the UAE. And they've really embraced a lot of trade liberalization. Okay, and while many countries have taken, the political decision to turn their back on globalization, the UAE has doubled down on that longstanding commitment to free international trade. So it's not really surprising to me. And the UAE has signed several significant trade deals with major emerging markets across the region. Some of these are the CEPA, which is the Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, okay, which is hoped will increase trade from 60 billion over the next 5 years, okay, So hopefully they're going to increase that trade to over 60 billion. And the agreement will remove 10,000 tariff lines from the goods and commodities list, including oil and gas, textile, and agriculture and jewelry, which is really going to open that sector up. And the agreement's going to allow the UAE partners, in addition to the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, to join in the negotiations with India, which commenced last year and got delayed for a little bit. But there's a lot of trade that goes between UAE and India. But it's in the process of also forging some other deals with Turkey, Israel, Indonesia, and even Colombia. So UAE is a great place. And then, of course, finally, Indonesia. And while Indonesia offers impressive opportunities, Indonesia has many supply chains and logistics challenges. So it's an emerging country with some challenges. And in fact, it's been illustrated by its high proportion of logistics costs to GDP. So, the cost to produce there was expensive in years past. It is trending downwards now, but despite its strong position at the top of the rankings, many in the country believe that the progress is not being made as quickly as it might be, as it's expected, especially given the government's aim to reduce logistics costs by a ratio of 17 to 24% by 2024. So in order for them to provide the basis for an economy-wide transformation, the Indonesian government has adopted a Making Indonesia 4.0 program. So if you're out there and you want to go and check it out on the Internet of Things, just Google, Making Indonesia 4.0 program. And this is really going to give you a whole high-level overview of their focus on innovation and development on 5 key sectors, which is going to be electronics, chemicals, automotive, food and beverage, and textiles. And they're heavily invested in developing these new sectors of manufacturing for them. And I think really Indonesia has recently adopted a digital national logistics ecosystem, what they call an NLE. And it's really designed to improve the flow of logistics and data and goods domestically and internationally. And its aim is to simplify business and the government processes associated with doing business in India. So, for example, 2 of its major goals are to reduce transit times from arrival at port to arrival at the warehouse and reduce congestion on Indonesia's roads through better planning. And lastly, I think Indonesia also has very close links to China, which not everyone is aware of. It's China's largest trading partner besides the United States, both in terms of imports and exports. And it's the second largest provider of foreign direct investment to Indonesia. So China's zero tolerance approach to CV-19 and the disruption it caused in its own country in manufacturing and supply chain has had a significant impact on Indonesia's economy. And this is kind of still lingering this year because Indonesia was sourcing a lot of raw materials from China. But as things start to unclog now, and Indonesia sort of has their own 4.0 program now, I think we're going to see that trend to opening up now and heading in the right direction as we move into 2024 and 2025. So, let's do a real quick recap. The top 5 countries, what do they make? India, they're really good at engineering goods, petroleum products, gems and jewelry, organic and inorganic chemicals, drugs and pharmaceuticals, electric goods, cottons, yarns, fabrics. India's a great place. Vietnam, again, electrical and machinery and equipment, footwear, gaiters, nuclear reactors, boilers, knitted apparel, clothing accessories, furniture, coffee, teas, and spices. perishables like fish and crustaceans, articles of leather, things like handbags and travel goods and mineral fuels and oils. And then we have countries like Thailand who are heavily involved in natural rubber and frozen shrimp and canned tuna and pineapples and a lot of foodstuffs, okay, and poultry and cassava. And it's also one of the largest exporters of sugar and rice in the world. And then we have, lastly, rounding that up, Malaysia, which is heavily involved in auto parts and components for auto parts. And of course, beverages and building and construction materials and hardware and chemicals and of course, computer software and electrical parts and components and prepared foods. And then finally, Bangladesh, ready-made garments and jute products. And of course, fish products like fish and shrimps and prawns. And then again, with their leather and leather products and agro products and their pharmaceutical products and plastic products. So, you know, these five countries, in addition to Mexico, are really some of the emerging countries out there. So I think, closing thoughts, and I know today's show is a little long. It's a big topic, but unfortunately, China is still making 85% of the world's goods. Many of our global partners have their own trading companies, and coupled with supply chain solutions, we can set up some meetings and discuss with you and your partners internally where you'd like to focus if you are considering leaving China and thinking about the decoupling process, and you just want to get together and talk about it. Jason and I would love to talk to you about it. We've got some amazing processes and things in place. We can offer our consulting services to help source new products that are free of China, that meet your quality standards and specification. Of course, the services aren't free. Our first meeting we're happy to take and broach the subject, but then if we get into a deep consultative project here, we can talk about that a little bit more. But we're here to help. We're here to help you negotiate a fair price that will get you and your end game moving some production out of China. And I think the purpose of this whole presentation was really to give you a high level overview of what the emerging countries are as the world begins to decouple from China, and also supply you with some valuable information and help you think about some of the things you need to consider about in terms of what's involved. So I really did miss Jason this week because I don't like to talk this much. But I want to thank everyone for tuning in. We're looking forward to having Jason back next week. I'm not sure if we're going to be doing our freight market roundup or we're going to have our great partner Sourcing Insights on our show. So I want to thank everybody. I hope you have a great rest of your week. If anyone's interested in receiving this presentation, it's a great PowerPoint presentation. I'd be happy to send it out to you. You could do a much deeper dive. And I just want to tell everybody, make it a great day. And thank you for tuning into the Ship Show one more time. Take care, everyone.